When the storm rolled in above the Illinois prairie, it brought more than just thunder and rain. It dragged along secrets, desperation, and an undercurrent of dread that clung to every damp brick and creaking floorboard in Galena. The night air was thick, oppressive, heavy with an expectancy that seemed almost alive. People lit extra candles, locked their doors against the ragged wind, and whispered superstitions they'd deny by daylight. Yet inside the Finch household, the world seemed to teeter on a silent, invisible edge. The Finch home was perched just to the edge of town, its gables stark against the surging clouds, surrounded by orderly gardens, now battered by the downpour. The house itself was old, lovingly maintained by Abigail's late father, its timbers speaking of generational resilience and quiet pride. Gaslight flickered in the windows, sending long shadows across the polished floors and wool rugs. Abigail Finch had lived all her 24 years under this roof, and though she'd often dreamed of far-off worlds and windswept adventures, tonight she felt like a child again, afraid of the unknown, longing for certainty. Abigail paced the length of the narrow hall, while thunder made the panes tremble. Though she wore the simple white cotton she preferred for evenings at home, there was an elegance about her posture, even in solitude. She moved like someone raised on discipline, who had learned to hide her restlessness behind busy hands, braiding her hair, straightening books on the parlor shelf, pausing every so often to gaze at the murky night on the other side of the glass. There was comfort in the routines of her household. The clocks chimed their hour, the old collie dog dozed in the kitchen, and from time to time Abigail's mother would lean into the sitting room, her voice gentle but edged with warning. Stay away from the windows during the lightning, love. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest in Abigail's mind. There were uneasy questions she dared not share about marriage, about the future, about Leonard Avery, whose shadow was never far from her own. Leonard was not there that night. He would not arrive until morning, having stayed to finish a legal brief in town. It was a small absence, the kind newlyweds expected, but loneliness had a way of pressing upon Abigail in moments like this. Their wedding only months prior had been the event of the season, an elaborate celebration that filled every pew and spilled into the farm roads, drawing gossip from every neighbor. The prettiest bride in Illinois, someone had whispered with a mixture of admiration and envy. Leonard, tall and composed, had promised to be her shelter from life's storms. For a while, Abigail believed it. Yet whispers lingered in small towns. People always noticed when a new face appeared, when an unfamiliar carriage arrived at the station, or when a stranger's boots left muddy prints by the church gate. The day before, Abigail had been to the milliner's and swore she saw a man she did not recognize, a broad-shouldered figure in a gray coat, his head bowed, standing just beyond the post office steps. She mentioned him to no one, but the image followed her, even now, as lightning illuminated the rain-washed yard. As the hour grew late, Abigail pressed her palms to the cold glass, peering into the streaked darkness. Each flash revealed the garden's chaos, the high fence bending beneath the wind. With every thunderclap came the memory of Leonard's last words that morning, oddly distant. "I'll be home for breakfast." Try to rest, Abby. But how could she find rest? Somewhere out on the road, a carriage will splashed in a puddle. Abigail's heart quickened. She strained to see through the downpour, wondering if Leonard's promise had been rearranged by urgency or fate. Yet the carriage passed by without stopping, its lamps vanishing into the gloom. All that remained was the endless drumming of rain and the sound of her own breath, shallow, anxious, waiting. Abandoning the window, Abigail wandered to the family portrait hung above the mantel shelf. Her father's steady gaze seemed to urge bravery. Her mother's painted smile offered hope. But what did portraits know of storms and marriage and the tremble in her chest that would not settle? Midnight approached. The household retreated into uneasy slumber. Abigail turned down the lamps, choosing instead to sit alone in the darkened parlor. She counted the seconds between lightning and thunder, an old trick to measure how far the storm truly was. But outside her carefully ordered world, miles beyond the town's watchful eyes, decisions were being made, the kind destined to fracture the peace of everyone who called Galena home. The stranger's arrival was marked by nothing more than a sodden hat and a muddy satchel. He'd passed beneath the station's gaslights unseen, walked the length of Main Street like a ghost, leaving barely a footprint behind. Had Abigail known, perhaps she would have called for her mother, bolted every door, prayed for morning to chase the terror away. But storms are loyal only to themselves, and fate is as indiscriminate as the rain. By dawn, the worst of the weather had passed, but the air was still heavy, as if the world were holding its breath. Abigail watched the sun rise, orange and forlorn through a haze of mist. She tried to bring order to the morning, pouring tea for her mother, opening the front door to let in fresh air, laying out a carefully ironed dress for when Leonard finally arrived. But a knock at the door made her freeze. The first of many that would haunt the Finches in the weeks to come. It was Mr. Clark, the baker, his hat in his hands and his face drawn. "Morning, Abigail," he managed, his voice too soft. "God keep you today." Behind him, the town was already gathering, news spreading before Abigail even understood what had happened. A body had been found on the edge of Miller's Field, barely recognizable, blood soaking the new grass. There could be no mistake, it was Leonard Avery. In that moment, standing framed in her doorway, as the townsfolk began to murmur, Abigail felt the thunder return. Not in the sky, but inside her. A tempest of questions, disbelief, and grief that would never truly recede. She did not faint. She did not scream. She simply sat, hands folded. The storm outside replaced by a deeper storm within. But this was only the beginning. Galena, so certain in its innocence, would never be the same. And for Abigail Finch, the journey from beloved bride to haunted widow would unravel with each cruel sunrise, each stranger's footstep, each secret dragged into harsh, unrelenting light. When the morning arrived in Galena, it seemed as though the storm had left a permanent mark on the town's memory. The streets were unusually quiet. The usual sounds of farmers hauling crates and children playing in alleyways replaced by an uneasy hush. Even tavern regulars found little comfort in their morning coffee. Gossip had always moved fast in Galena, but today it felt more like dread than idle curiosity. Fragile, raw, lingering in every whispered conversation and nervous glance. At the Finch home, Abigail's mother, Martha, remained stoic as the news spread. She busied herself with chores, refusing to let tears fall, her instinct as a mother shielding Abigail from the worst of the details. Abigail herself was barely present, lost in a haze of grief and disbelief. Leonard Avery's death was not simply a tragedy, it was a puzzle, the kind that drew suspicion with every unanswered question. Sheriff Hobbs arrived before the town's pastor. He brought with him the weight of his badge and a solemn promise to find the truth. The Finch parlor filled quickly with neighbors and friends, each eager to offer solace, or perhaps glean some fact that might lift the fog settled thick over Galena. Abigail's response was almost mechanical, her answers brief. Yes, Leonard had seemed troubled lately. No, she had not seen him after work the night before. Yes, there was a stranger in town, though she couldn't say for sure if he mattered. She felt herself shrinking beneath all the attention, wishing she could simply disappear into the walls. By noon, the local physician had arrived, Dr. Price, a gentle man with rimless glasses and gray hair combed back. He confirmed what the sheriff already suspected. Leonard's death was improbable as an accident, impossible as a suicide. The nature of his wounds, the location of the body, the absence of any clear motive painted a grim portrait. Abigail sat on the edge of her father's favorite chair as Dr. Price whispered details to Martha, careful not to say too much within earshot. All day, Abigail watched her life unravel. The wedding photographs on the mantel, the crystal perfume bottles on her vanity, the letters Leonard left her tucked inside her Bible. These relics mocked her now, reminders not just of a man lost, but of a future shattered. People came and went, many offering pies or handkerchiefs, their faces taut with the fear that something wicked had infiltrated their safe world. Galena's pastor, Reverend Paulson, led neighbors in silent prayer that evening. He offered polite condolences. His hands trembled, his words clipped and formal. Behind his prayers was the clear knowledge that murder had come to Galena, and now everyone was a little less certain of their God, a little more afraid of their neighbor. Meanwhile, near the edge of town, whispers grew louder. Mrs. Harper swore she'd seen a figure walking toward Miller's field through the storm, sheltering beneath a ragged umbrella. Young Thomas Kelly, who delivered milk, spoke of hoofbeats on the road that did not belong to any town horse. The innkeeper, Mr. Mooney, confessed to the sheriff that a man fitting Abigail's description of the stranger had checked in late the previous afternoon, paid for a room in cash, and vanished by morning. With every rumor, the sense of safety weakened. The sheriff followed each lead, his notebook filling with names and statements. He interviewed laborers, clerks, and the town blacksmith. Everyone, it seemed, was a suspect, and every minor disagreement became a source of suspicion. In Galena, history was rarely forgotten, but now the townsfolk pressed for secrets and grudges best left buried. Abigail wondered, through the endless hours of questioning and condolence, if anyone truly knew Leonard. Was he hiding debts? Had he feuded with someone at the office? Was his charm too convincing, his smile too well rehearsed? With every question, Abigail's world grew less familiar. Her grief mixed with confusion and a growing sense of dread. Was she somehow responsible? Had she missed an urgent warning? When evening came, Martha convinced Abigail to rest. Upstairs, in her childhood bedroom, Abigail lay staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling. The wind outside carried echoes of last night's storm, and every sound made her flinch. Sleep did not come easily. She clung to Leonard's last letter, written in neat, careful script, and tried to remember the promise of their wedding day, the whispered vows, the laughter in his eyes, the hush as friends raised glasses to new beginnings. Below stairs, Martha collected discarded teacups and damp jackets. The house was quieter now. Most visitors had gone home. Martha wished for the strength to comfort her daughter, but she too was haunted by regrets and fears. In the hall, she found Abigail's wedding dress, recently pressed and wrapped for storage. In the golden light of dusk, its delicate lace and ribbons seemed unbearably cruel, a relic of joy now marred by grief. Outside, the sheriff continued his investigation, following footprints revealed by the fading rain. He pondered the stranger's motive, the meaning of Leonard's unfinished legal brief, the odd way the body had been discovered. Face turned toward the dawn, arms outstretched as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. Phoebe Bradshaw, Abigail's childhood friend, visited just after sunset. She brought flowers, wild daisies and bluebells from the fields, and sat quietly beside Abigail. The two women said little, but Phoebe's presence was calming. Through silence, Abigail found some comfort, allowing herself to cry at last, not the silent tears she'd been holding, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to cleanse a fraction of her sorrow. As darkness settled, the bells of Galena's church sounded the hour. Every window glowed with lamplight, every door locked against the unknown. Neighbors knelt beside their beds, praying for justice or simple peace. Abigail slept fitfully, troubled by dreams of storms and whispered warnings, waking often to the realization that the old world was gone and a new, grimmer one had taken its place. But in the heart of grief, even fear must be endured. Abigail Finch, bride and now widow, made a silent promise. Tomorrow, she would rise and face whatever remained. She would try to understand the puzzle of Leonard's death and the stranger's purpose. She would seek the truth no matter how terrible, because some storms do not bring an ending, but only a beginning woven in pain, resilience, and the long, uncertain search for answers in a town that had lost its innocence overnight. Galena did not sleep for days after the discovery in Miller's Field. The routines that anchored its people, morning bread delivery, Sunday sermons, quiet evenings with the latest news from Chicago, sputtered and stalled, as though the whole town held its breath, waiting for clarity that might never come. The murder of Leonard Avery was not just a local tragedy. It was a fracture that revealed every hidden weakness, every buried animosity, every secret the townsfolk tried to forget. Sheriff Hobbs led the investigation with a mixture of resolve and dread. Leonard Avery had been well-liked, a rising star in local law and politics. The sheriff, who had known Leonard since he was a boy, found himself torn by duty and emotion. He spent long hours walking the muddy back roads between the Finch home and Miller's Field, piecing together witness accounts, and straining to separate fact from rumor. The innkeeper, Mr. Mooney, provided the first real clue. The stranger who checked into his establishment left behind only a barely legible signature in the guest log, Mr. Black, and paid in cash. All that remained in the room was a torn scrap of newspaper, a stub of candle, and the faint smell of foreign tobacco. Mooney described the man as quiet, strong jaw, eyes like he's never truly at rest. The name meant nothing, but the presence was undeniable. Abigail found herself swept into the investigation, a reluctant heroine in a drama she never wanted. Each morning, 2 women from church came with casseroles and sweet rolls, their presence as much for surveillance as comfort. Friends she'd known since childhood arrived unannounced, hoping to glean some detail that might elevate their own status when gossip next flowed in the general store. Abigail hated the attention, the way her pain was scrutinized, dissected, and sometimes judged. She clung to Phoebe, who was steadfast as ever, and to her mother, whose touch grew gentler with each day's ordeal. Sheriff Hobbs questioned Abigail repeatedly, always apologizing for his persistence. "Miss Finch," he'd begin, removing his hat as a sign of respect, "I know this is hard, but I need you to think, really think, about anything unusual. Any argument, any letter, any person who might have wished Leonard harm." Abigail tried. She remembered Leonard's sudden preoccupation with a legal case for the railroad company, the way he seemed tense before leaving for work, the brief, heated phone call he'd received the week before the murder. She offered every memory she could muster, and it was never enough. The town, meanwhile, started its own investigation. Leonard's rivals in business and politics became targets of speculation. The lawyers at his firm were dissected for motive: envy, money, old debts. Laborers resentful over land disputes were gossiped about by their own wives. It was all so much noise, and Abigail felt herself drowning in it. Then, one afternoon, as the wind whipped the prairie dust into spirals, Martha Finch discovered something odd in the kitchen garden, a muddy footprint leading to the back gate. She called Sheriff Hobbs, who examined it closely. The tread matched no local boot. It was a small discovery, but in a town starved for meaning, it fueled both hope and anxiety. That week, the sheriff's search stretched beyond Galena's limits. He questioned railway clerks, telegraph operators, and loss adjusters. At the railway station, a porter recalled seeing a man matching Mooney's description board the earliest train out after the storm, face obscured by a battered hat. Where he was headed, no one could say. Rumors swirled about Leonard's financial dealings. Had he uncovered corruption at the railroad firm? Had he been threatened when he refused to bend the law? Abigail learned, to her horror, that Leonard had quietly mortgaged his portion of the Avery estate. She found the papers in the bottom of his desk, unsigned, along with handwritten notes about a meeting he'd scheduled with a man named John Temple. The sheriff followed up, but Temple claimed no knowledge of any dispute, only that Leonard had seemed agitated, distracted, like a man walking under a dark cloud. The funeral approached, and Galena braced itself as if for another storm. Abigail chose a simple dress, her veil black as midnight. The procession through Main Street was slow, somber, the church crowded with mourners. Reverend Paulson spoke gently of faith, forgiveness, and the fragility of happiness. Abigail's hands never trembled. Through the service, she held her mother's arm, grateful for the small comfort of a shared burden. Afterward, the Finch house became a sanctuary for Abigail and Martha, but never truly safe. Reporters from Chicago arrived, eager for a sensational angle. Small-town bride in the murder that shocked Illinois. Abigail refused them all. She retreated to her room, where she tried to organize the shards of memory and pain into some semblance of order, but nothing fit. Leonard's absence was total. His laughter, his quarrels, his tender notes all vanished, and in their place lingered only uncertainty. In the evenings, Abigail stared at the storm-streaked sky, recalling the first night of tragedy. She wondered if she could ever move past that moment, the feeling that her entire life had been upended by one decision, one stranger, one night when fate turned its gaze on Galena. She wondered, too, if Leonard had known his end was near, if he tried to warn her, or if he believed, until the very last, that love might be enough to shield them both. Weeks passed, and the investigation stalled. The stranger had disappeared. The clues had grown cold. Galena's people wanted closure, but found only silence. Abigail grew weary of waiting. She resolved to keep searching, to piece together Leonard's final days, to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or difficult. And so the stage was set, the town haunted, a bride seeking answers, a world changed forever by a single act of violence. As spring gave way to summer, the prairie bloomed and withered, and Galena, once peaceful, waited for the next whisper, the next secret, the next step toward justice and understanding. As Galena struggled under the weight of its loss, daily routines resumed but were forever altered. The market square was quieter now, and people moved with a cautious, almost reverent solemnity. Women clung to shopping lists, and men lingered over morning coffee, sharing furtive glances rather than jokes. The mill's rhythmic clatter continued, but the laughter of mill workers had dulled, their conversations peppered with rumors about Leonard's death. Even the children sensed the shift in the air, their games becoming subdued, their laughter rare. The social life of Galena in 1891 was tightly woven, built on years of shared hardship, community events, and family dinners. News spread through word of mouth, Mrs. Harper at the bakery, Mr. Clark at the barber shop, the young Kelly twins running errands. Such closeness had always created an illusion of safety, a belief that tragedy could only knock at a stranger's door. Now, the doors remained locked even in the daytime. Abigail became a subject of both sympathy and suspicion. For some, her grief was a wound to be soothed with pies or prayer. For others, it was something to be examined, dissected, and judged behind closed curtains. She felt the eyes of shopkeepers pause on her as she passed, conversations halting wherever she entered. The woman who had been celebrated as a blushing bride was now the focus of whispers. What did she know? What wasn't she telling us? To protect Abigail, Martha Finch became fiercely defensive. She accompanied her daughter on errands with a deliberate pride, greeting every acquaintance as if to remind them of the Finch family's resilience. Martha took pains to maintain appearances, insisting on Sunday church attendance and dinners at home with the windows open, even prouder in her grief than she had ever been in joy. Reverend Paulson, aware of the strain, made a point to visit the Finch home more often. He led short, gentle prayers and tried to steer the conversation toward forgiveness and communal healing. Abigail, grateful for his presence, found his words soothing but remote. Faith felt fragile in a world so suddenly upended. She spent long hours staring at the nave's stained glass, searching for hope, for guidance, for anything that might lead her out of the labyrinth of mourning. Through the summer, rumors continued to swirl. The sheriff, exhausted but resolute, maintained the investigation's momentum as best he could. His deputy, a stoic man named O'Malley, scanned every train manifest and questioned every postmaster for signs of the stranger who'd vanished. Hobbs himself grew gaunt and weary. Sleep eluded him, and every inconclusive interview eroded his confidence in Galena's innocence. In the evenings, Abigail sought solace in letters, journals, and the unspoken comfort of routine. She would help Martha prepare supper, set the table, and then dawdle in her father's study, leafing through old county ledgers, hoping they might offer distraction or accidental insight. One night, she found a forgotten letter from Leonard tucked between records of land holdings. It was addressed in a hurried scrawl to a Judge Wilkins, and though little was said explicitly, Abigail noticed a phrase that startled her. If the matter escalates, have Mr. Black accompany you. The next morning, prompted by uneasy curiosity, Abigail persuaded Martha to inquire discreetly about Judge Wilkins at the post office. The postmaster, Mr. Connolly, offered a vague response. Wilkins left town a week ago, headed to Chicago. The name Mr. Black prompted a hesitant pause, but Connolly ultimately shook his head. No, he hadn't seen anyone matching that stranger's description. The Finch home became a haven of speculation. Abigail wondered if Leonard's work as a lawyer had exposed him to danger. Was Mr. Black a protector, or something else entirely? Meanwhile, the townsfolk began to fracture along old lines. The Avery family, Leonard's relatives, remained aloof, sympathetic but decisive in their belief that Leonard's death was the result of business rivalry. The Bradshaws, longtime friends of the Finches, urged Abigail to seek solace in action and justice. Other families worried that more tragedy could come, and some, bitter and frightened, quietly discouraged their children from playing with Abigail. This isolation was both a comfort and a curse. On good days, Abigail found solace in her routines, the attentions of Phoebe, and the steady presence of Martha. On bad days, she felt trapped, suffocated by her role as Galina's grieving widow and suspected informant. On the worst days, she wondered whether the accusations were true, and whether she herself had missed some crucial detail, some warning that might have saved Leonard. Throughout July, the prairie air shimmered with heat. The fields outside town stood golden and heavy. The world seemed to pause and hold its breath, awaiting the first sign of harvest. Farmers grumbled about late-season storms and anxious livestock, but none could ignore the tension simmering below the surface. The Kelly twins, bold as ever, discovered a half-burnt note near Miller's field that referenced a shipment and a change of plans. The sheriff dutifully collected the scrap, but it led nowhere. As another storm approached, Martha gathered the household for supper. Abigail listened to the thunder echo across the open land, grieving for Leonard and for the world she had lost. Galina was changing, its innocence crumbling with the realization that even the most beloved among them could fall victim to violence and mystery. But Abigail was changing, too. The sadness had given way to determination, a dogged desire to uncover the truth, defend the dignity of her family, and perhaps, one day, reclaim her place among her countrymen. The pain would not be easily soothed, but Abigail Finch, for the first time since that terrible night, began to believe that understanding might one day be possible, if only she resisted despair. As the storm crept closer, Abigail stared out the window, resolved to delve deeper, to follow her instincts, and to decipher the signals hidden in her lost husband's past. Galina, too, waited, uncertain, divided, forever marked by the shadow of violence, the memory of a summer that would never be forgotten, and the hope that even the deepest wounds might reveal a path toward healing. By midsummer, the valley around Galina wore a humid haze, and its old brick streets began to crack under the relentless Illinois sun. Once a thriving river port, Galina was now a shadow of its past prosperity, its faded Victorian facades and narrow lanes telling stories of fortunes made and lost. The town's identity, rooted in mining and steamboats, was shifting beneath the weight of new realities. All this change seemed only to deepen the unease following Leonard's murder, as though the town itself sensed a time of reckoning had arrived. The Finch home felt the tension most acutely. With each day, Martha and Abigail grew more isolated, their world shrinking to the rooms of their old house and the rare visits from trusted friends. For Abigail, this new confinement brought an acute awareness of what was lost, not just Leonard, but the sense of belonging she once took for granted. She lingered by the parlor window, watching the world outside grow less familiar with every passing day, and counted the carriages moving down Main Street, speculating about which ones might carry hostile eyes or sympathetic hearts. Elsewhere, Galina's families closed ranks. Neighbors who once borrowed sugar and exchanged gossip on stoops now turned inward, wary of betrayal, of scandal, of being drawn into suspicion or smear. The Avery family was the most visible in their withdrawal, their wealth and influence making them both untouchable and resented. Leonard's younger brother, Harvey, made a point of attending meetings of the city council, where public debates over law and security had become heated. Old feuds flared. Responsibility for Galina's new troubles was flung about as freely as accusations of hidden debts and illicit liaisons. In the church, support for Abigail remained, but it was cautious, even conditional. Some parishioners offered prayers and politely worded notes, while others withheld invitations, as if proximity to tragedy might prove contagious. Only Phoebe persisted, undeterred by whispers, willing to stand at Abigail's side as townsfolk increasingly divided themselves by old loyalties and new fears. Trouble also brewed at the town's remaining businesses. The mills and warehouses that once made Galina a commercial hub now worried over idle machinery, waning demand, and the constant specter of new crime. At the post office, Mr. Connolly fielded more anonymous letters than ever before, anonymous tips and veiled threats, wild stories that placed guilt on passing laborers, vagrants, and outsiders. Even Judge Wilkins, recently returned from Chicago, was drawn into the web of intrigue, quizzed by townsfolk about his knowledge of Leonard's last legal battles. Amid this turmoil, Abigail began to revisit her own memories of Leonard's final months. In quiet moments, she sifted through his old correspondence, searching for hints, financial ledgers, telegram receipts, his half-drafted speeches about Galena's civic future. Some of the papers were carefully organized, as if Leonard had been preparing to leave a record for someone, maybe her. Others were scattered, abrupt, almost desperate in tone. She began to wonder whether Leonard had sensed the danger that was coming, or if the pressure of his ambitions simply grew too heavy to bear alone. It was on a stifling Thursday morning that Abigail, in desperation, made the journey to Leonard's old law firm. The offices were cramped, the walls lined with dusty case files and the scent of pipe smoke. Mr. Lyle, Leonard's former partner, received her with a worn courtesy. He admitted that Leonard had been preoccupied with a land dispute involving the railway, a dispute that had escalated rapidly, drawing in powerful interests from outside town. He tried to do right by everybody, Lyle said, voice wavering. But someone always lost when the boundaries moved, and not everyone played fair. Abigail pressed further, asking about Mr. Black and the mysterious Judge Wilkins meeting. Lyle shrugged helplessly, but mentioned receiving a threatening note himself, unsigned, warning him to drop the case or expect chaos. The threat now felt all too real, a fate sealed not just for Leonard, but for anyone who drew attention to the wrong secrets. Abigail left the firm no closer to answers, but newly aware of how entangled her husband's life had become, and how vulnerable she remained. Back at home, Martha met her with a worried frown. The house felt unusually cold for July, the rooms echoing with the ghost of unspoken grief. Abigail confided her fears to her mother, who listened intently. To Martha, the mystery was not just about Leonard's death anymore, but about the wider unraveling of their town. She reminded Abigail that Galena had always recovered from adversity, wars, floods, the loss of river trade, and urged her not to yield to despair. Courage multiplies when you share it, Martha whispered, hugging her tightly. And you'll need all you have. Life in Galena pressed forward. The summer harvest approached, and the first wagons of grain rolled through Main Street. School teachers planned for the fall. The church choir rehearsed new hymns, and merchants hoped business would return as fear faded. But a new layer of caution colored every interaction, and trust seemed in shorter supply than ever before. One evening, as lightning danced above the hills and the scent of rain drifted through open windows, Abigail sat at Leonard's old desk, struggling to make sense of the fragments left behind. She started a diary, not just for herself, but to record the threads that ran from Leonard's work to the town's anxieties, and to her own transformation from wife to widow, from onlooker to reluctant detective. Each entry became a plea for clarity, a way of reclaiming the agency she feared was slipping from her grasp. It was there, by the uncertain light of dusk, that Abigail made a quiet vow. No matter how many obstacles the town or fate itself placed in her path, she would see Leonard's story to its end. She would map out every clue, every rumor, every hidden deal until the darkness cleared and Galena could look itself in the eye once more. And in the act of searching, perhaps she could redeem something for herself, for the memory of a husband she still loved, and for the future that might yet be built from the ashes of tragedy. Summer deepened over Galena, and the sun pressed down on the town's brick streets and Victorian facades, spotlighting both its faded grandeur and the fractures in its spirit. Once the jewel of the Mississippi River, Galena had known boom times, steamboats lining the docks, miners hauling lead across cobble lanes, theater crowds filling the downtown. In the 1890s, those days were slipping into memory. The railroads now carried most trade, the river often ran low, and the grand homes that once belonged to mine owners now bore the quiet dignity of decline. Abigail Finch moved through this world with a kind of haunted poise. She woke before dawn to the sound of carriages rumbling over uneven stone, the distant shouts of farmers in the fields. The Finch house stood apart on its small hill, the paint wearing thin, its gardens more wild than formal. Each day, Abigail watched the shifting patterns of life below, the market bustling in fits and starts, the church bells summoning mourners and worshippers, the slow parade of wagons that promised commerce, but too often brought only echoes. At home, the pressures mounted. Martha grew more careful, urging Abigail not to visit downtown alone, reminding her to keep watch for unfamiliar faces. The house seemed to echo with absences, Leonard's voice, his boots by the door, the soft laughter that once filled the front sitting room. Abigail tried to fill the emptiness with routine, but the rituals became shadows of the life they had lost. Galena's leaders responded to the troubles with their own rituals. City council meetings fraught with tension, new ordinances, and grand promises to restore safety and prosperity. Leonard's brother Harvey, now acting as an informal spokesman for the family, was everywhere, lobbying for tighter regulations on business, advocating extra patrols along the river docks, warning that Galena's reputation stood at a crossroads. His words carried weight, but the undertone was fear. The Avery household, once a symbol of Galena's promise, now represented its anxieties. Meanwhile, Abigail tried to advance the search for answers. Each morning she pored over Leonard's papers, jotting notes about names and debts, circling cryptic remarks in his legal files. She mapped out the connections: Judge Wilkins, Mr. Lyle, the land dispute at the railroad, the stranger called Mr. Black. Sometimes the notes seemed to form patterns. Other times, she wondered if she were chasing ghosts. One afternoon, pressed by hope and desperation, Abigail rode with Phoebe into the outskirts of Galena, their buggy rattling past the remnants of old mills and abandoned mine entrances. The landscape bore scars of the gold and lead rush, empty buildings, battered fences, and the silent testimony of prosperity lost. At the edge of the old courting farm, Abigail paused, remembering half-forgotten stories of feuds and broken promises. Phoebe urged her forward. "Sometimes you have to risk finding the truth, Abby, even if it's not what you want to hear." The discoveries were gradual. Abigail unearthed an unsigned contract between Leonard's firm and a group of unnamed investors. A careful reading revealed irregularities, clause changes, missing signatures, and a reference to a shipment by rail, due before autumn. Confronted with ambiguity, Abigail returned to the law offices, pressing Mr. Lyle again for information. This time, Lyle admitted that Leonard had confided fears about sabotage, bribes, and threats from powerful out-of-town interests. He explained the growing tension between those who wanted Galena's economic revival and those willing to cut dangerous corners to secure quick profits. Leonard cared too much, Lyle confessed. He wanted to heal Galena's wounds, but some wounds fester when you try to expose them. Back in town, rumors blossomed anew. Some whispered of business rivals. Others believed a labor dispute had turned tragic. A few muttered about corruption in the council itself. Abigail sensed the town's collective anxiety and began to understand the complexity of the forces arrayed against Leonard. The murder was no simple crime. It was the product of tangled loyalties, desperate ambitions, and a history longer than any one life. Martha watched Abigail's investigation with a mixture of worry and pride. She reminded her daughter that seeking justice, though noble, would place her in harm's way, and that not everyone in Galena would welcome the truth. But Abigail persisted, drawing courage from the memory of Leonard's ideals and the need for closure. Her search became both a tribute and a rebellion, an assertion that despair must always yield to resilience. The river, almost silent now, reflected the changing fortunes of the town. Some families left for Chicago, others clung tightly to what remained. The nights grew longer, and the storms more frequent, as if the land itself mourned. Yet life did not stop. The market reopened. The church choir sang. Children ran games behind picket fences. Galena held on with stubborn hope, believing that wounds might scab over, and that each new day might bring an answer or relief. In the gathering twilight one evening, as Abigail walked home past the old cigar factory and the courthouse with its limestone arch, she felt the world pause. For a moment, The old glories of Galena shimmered above the modern anxieties, a town that had endured boom and bust, war and peace, innocence and tragedy. She realized her journey was not only about Leonard, but also about reclaiming Galena's dignity and future. Returning home, Abigail wrote one more diary entry, her hand steady in the candlelight. She vowed to continue asking questions, to resist the fear that had settled over her town, and to remember that the heart of Galena was not in its buildings or businesses, but in the quiet strength of those willing to seek the truth, even when the world grew dark. The chapter ended with the promise of another day. Summer waned. The investigation continued, and Abigail Finch found herself standing on the boundary between grief and determination, between the history Galena cherished and the future it had yet to win. August melted into September, and the heat clung stubbornly to the valley as the people of Galena pressed on, heavier with each passing day. The golden fields outside town were readying for harvest, their abundance standing in stark contrast to the poverty and uncertainty gnawing at the edges of daily life. Galena was a town built on hope, first in lead and steamboats, then in railways and dreams. Now for Abigail Finch and those closest to her, hope was measured in the possibility of answers, of justice, of peace returning to their fractured world. At home, Abigail reached new depths of exhaustion. Her diary, once full of questions and theories, swelled with names, confrontations, and the smallest shifts in mood or routine. The investigation had become her life, a puzzle that grew more tangled, more desperate with every interview, every scrap of evidence. Martha watched this transformation with a mother's worry and pride, offering wisdom and gentle reminders not to neglect her own healing. The streets of Galena remained marked by the town's history. The sturdy brick buildings, old stockades, and limestone arches now took on a gloomier cast. Yet beneath the weight of tragedy, some element persisted. The hum of the market on Saturdays, the hymn that drifted from church windows, even the laughter of children briefly unfazed by adult anxieties. For a moment each morning, Galena seemed as it was before Leonard Avery's death had divided the town and cast suspicion in every direction. Sheriff Hobbs pressed ahead with the inquiry, undeterred by dead ends and misleading testimony. He became a familiar sight at council meetings, arguing for more organized patrols and pushing for transparency among Galena's influential families. Harvey Avery, Leonard's brother, remained a constant adversary. His efforts to shield the Avery name both protected and exacerbated tensions. The council sessions grew more contentious, and rumors of cover-ups dogged both the sheriff and the Avery estate. Abigail's search for clarity advanced on two fronts. With Phoebe's loyal support, she pieced together more of Leonard's personal dealings. Letters with hastily added postscript notes, contracts which referenced outsiders known only by initials, meeting records from disputes that never appeared in the local press. Many clues pointed not to malice at home, but a ruthless ambition among out-of-town investors and railroad speculators, determined to force Galena's transformation on their terms. One late afternoon, as Abigail soothed her nerves with a walk past the Muselle cigar factory, she overheard two laborers speaking in low tones about a hidden ledger. The words struck her with urgency, and she traced the rumor to its origin, a half-abandoned storeroom behind the old Dowling building, flooded with dusty sunlight. There, she found records missing from Leonard's study, a bundle of documents showing bribes, secret payments, and withdrawals that didn't match what his official ledgers claimed. Armed with these papers, Abigail met again with Mr. Lyle, who confirmed the suspicions she had kept at the edge of her mind for weeks. Leonard had been caught in the crosshairs of powerful interests, and someone intimately involved in Galena's financial web had ensured his silence. Unable to name the culprit outright, Lyle pointed to a circle of suspicion that included not only rivals from Chicago, but also some of Galena's own respected businessmen, men whose fortunes and legacies depended on secrecy as much as success. Phoebe urged Abigail not to confront anyone alone, reminding her of how quickly gossip could turn to malice. Together they brought the evidence to Sheriff Hobbs, whose gratitude was tempered with resignation. He knew the town's appetite for truth was matched only by its vulnerability. "Much as I want justice, Miss Finch, I must warn you, Exposing these things will change Galena forever. Not all wounds heal when you open them. Still, the investigation took on new momentum. With fresh evidence and a mounting sense of urgency, the sheriff questioned those named in the ledgers. Rumors flared, and for days Main Street was alive with tension as several prominent businessmen withdrew from public life. Lawyers drafted urgent letters, and the city council called an emergency session. Meanwhile, Martha Finch suffered a brief spell of illness, perhaps the product of strain, perhaps the persistent sadness that would not yield. Abigail pressed forward, comforting her mother in quiet moments and sharing her hopes for justice. Days blurred into nights, and Abigail's resolve deepened. Whatever threats came, whatever secrets remained, she would not yield until Leonard's murder was acknowledged and answered. Then, on a cold September morning, came the first confession. A railroad supervisor named Ewan confessed to accepting a bribe and helped unravel the scheme, pointing to a web of illicit deals and corrupt contracts that had triggered confrontation, threats, and ultimately murder. Sheriff Hobbs pursued the leads, securing further confessions and evidence, and forcing the council to confront the depth of its own compromise. As the details came to light, Galena braced itself. Some citizens were shocked, others quietly relieved, and a few refused to accept the facts, preferring to keep old grievances intact. Abigail felt a strange mixture of triumph and grief. She had found the truth, but it did not restore Leonard, nor erase the scars the investigation had left on her home, her family, or her town. The council voted to remove those involved from office, the guilty were charged, and new regulations promised to safeguard against similar tragedies. Galena would heal, but not quickly. Trust would not be rebuilt in a month or a year. Yet the resolve of Abigail Finch offered hope. That one woman, wounded by loss and compelled by love for the truth, had pushed the town toward honesty when no one else dared. As September faded into October, Abigail stood at Leonard's grave. The town gathered around her. She spoke of reconciliation, of lessons learned, and of a future shaped by courage rather than fear. The bells rang for the first time in months, not just for mourning, but for the possibility of peace returning to Galena. The past would remain, etched in brick, in memory, in the fields and river that held old secrets. But the final days of summer brought the quiet promise of renewal, and Abigail Finch, clearer now than ever, walked toward the uncertain future, neither bride nor widow, but a survivor, a seeker, and the heart of a town learning to find its place once again. October swept into Galena with a brisk wind and a muted sky, declaring an end to months of suffocating heat and grief. The prairie's harvest lay stacked in golden mounds ready for storage, signaling nature's assurance that, even after hardship, renewal was still possible. Through the center of Galena, Main Street echoed with a newfound vitality. Its buildings, aged but defiant, watched life flow past. The market stalls reopened, couples strolled beneath Victorian awnings, and children's laughter returned to alleys long silent. In the Finch house, Abigail felt the subtle shift, a rhythm less mournful, a spirit forging hope from ruin. After the storm of investigation and confrontation, she found herself in the gentle hum of daily life. Martha bustling in the kitchen, neighbors dropping off fresh bread or wildflowers, evenings spent reading aloud together as lamplight flickered and the world outside settled. No longer a house of isolation, the Finch home became a refuge, its doors open to friends seeking comfort or counsel. The aftermath of the revelations had shaken Galena deeply. Leaders accused of wrongdoing resigned in disgrace. A handful faced formal charges, their legacies unraveling in the public record. Town meetings filled with passionate voices, some pleading for swift justice, others for reconciliation. Amid fierce debate, new ordinances passed, demanding accountability in business, politics, and law. Fellows who once avoided Abigail sought her out for perspective. She did not gloat or pontificate. Rather, she spoke of Leonard's ideals: kindness, integrity, and the belief that truth, however painful, could foster healing if nurtured carefully. Harriet Bradshaw and other civic leaders organized a festival on the riverbank, the first gathering since Leonard's funeral. Vendors painted signs in bold letters, musicians tuned their strings, and townsfolk prepared dishes both humble and grand. The celebration was no hollow distraction. Speeches honored those lost, shared tears turned into embraces, and children chased each other among the hay bales. For Abigail, it marked the beginning of her return not only to society, but to herself. She laughed with Phoebe beneath the autumn leaves, watched the river sparkle in morning sun, and, at last, felt the burden in her chest begin to lift. Throughout the season, Abigail's diary transformed from a ledger of questions into one of answers and resolve. She chronicled her investigation, the discoveries and defeats, the turning points recorded with quiet honesty. In time, her writings served as a guide for others, Phoebe, Martha, and younger neighbors, searching for meaning in personal loss. She did not shy away from the pain or betrayals, nor did she dwell in past bitterness. Instead, she turned the pages on each sorrow, offering compassion and pragmatism to those who needed it most. Martha, who had suffered quietly during the worst days, found herself surrounded anew by old friends and family. Her strength returned, first in small gestures, like baking pies for the church bazaar, then in larger ones such as hosting community forums on coping with grief. The Finch home earned a reputation for gentle wisdom, for hospitality that never stifled dignity or truth. Weekly suppers drew the Averys, the Bradshaws, and other long-time neighbors together, fostering fresh bonds and candid conversation. By Christmas, Martha would say to Abigail, "What we keep is what we give away." Leonard's memory belongs not just to us, but to the town that he loved. Galena's new council invited Abigail to serve on the Oversight Committee for Business Ethics and Historical Preservation. She hesitated, fearing the scrutiny, but Martha insisted, "It's your chance to ensure what happened never happens again." Abigail accepted, lending her calm voice and measured insight. At public debates, she urged transparency and restraint, reminding Galena that its endurance rested not solely in laws or festivals, but in the daily choices of its people. With fresh reforms, Galena's economic prospects brightened. The market bustled as goods arrived by rail and river, old mills adapted their operations, and local artisans found new buyers in neighboring towns. Families once fractured by scandal slowly reunited. Invitations reappeared, children played together after school, and volunteers gathered to beautify parks and repair the old Lutheran chapel. Through civic effort and consensus, Galena's wounds became paths for renewal. Abigail's outreach expanded. She visited the field where Leonard had died, planting a ring of iris around the old marker as a living tribute. At church, she organized reading circles and counseling for widows and orphans, drawing on her own loss to build resilience in others. With Phoebe, she coordinated charity efforts for those displaced by the scandal, helped teach literacy to young mothers, and spoke quietly at memorials held at the foot of the courthouse steps. The change in Galena was not instant nor universal. Some families left, unable to bear the weight of memory. Others struggled with lingering bitterness. Yet the majority found hope in new rituals. Thanksgiving feasts where prayers for the departed gave way to celebration for the survivors, winter festivals where music drowned out old arguments, and classroom projects where students interviewed elders about Galena's history, hearing firsthand how adversity shaped the life of their town. Leonard's grave became a place of collective remembrance. Abigail visited regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes with Martha and Phoebe, sometimes joined by a dozen others who brought small tokens or stood in silence. She read aloud from his letters and speeches, believing that the voice of the lost could heal the wounds of the living. Children sometimes asked her about Leonard. She would smile and recount his sense of justice, his gentle humor, and the way he always believed Galena was a town worth fighting for. By the end of winter, the town felt fundamentally changed, not whole, not free of pain, but open to possibility. Abigail's influence was steady and understated. Her story, once used as both warning and inspiration, became a lesson in resilience for all. In early spring, the council asked her to address the town at the dedication of a new memorial garden. Standing before friends, neighbors, and those who once doubted her, Abigail spoke quietly. "We cannot erase the past, nor should we wish to. But with honesty, compassion, and patience, we can shape our future. Let Leonard's memory, and all our memories, teach us to be better. As the crowd dispersed, Abigail walked home beneath a sky pale with promise. The river glistened, the marketplace hummed, and laughter rang clear as bells through the evening air. In her journal she wrote, "Galena endures. I endure." The story carries forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. Every ending was a beginning. Abigail knew her own healing might never be complete, but she also understood that to live is to move forward with loss, to choose hope when hope is hardest. As darkness fell and lamplight glowed from every window, Abigail Finch stood in her kitchen, ready for what would come next. A woman shaped by tragedy, defined by courage, a witness to both the storm and the calm, a reminder to all of Galena. Beauty can rise from sorrow, and no heart is truly alone.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.